When Ireland was cut in two in 1921, homes were too. Families could have dinner on one side of the border, then go to the kitchen to wash dishes, and cross the Irish border again. How could this be possible? Well, here is Ireland in 1920. Okay, now watch closely, here it comes. Boom, Ireland in 1921. The island was meant to be split temporarily between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, but why was Ireland cut in two like this? There are some mysteries in history that just seem so obvious looking back. To create that obviousness for you, let's gather clues from Irish history at 3 levels of magnification, starting with the big picture. The furthest I'd like to zoom out for you is the 12th century. This is absolutely not the beginning of Irish history, but it is its first major intersection with British history. The Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland resulted in the first attempt at English colonization, the so-called English lordship of Ireland proclaimed in 1171. This set off a series of English attempts to control the whole of Ireland, not just little chunks of it. They often did this through a practice known as planting. Plantations were an attempt to bring those loyal to the English monarch, mostly Protestants, to Ireland. It involved displacing Gaelic Irish natives, who were mostly Catholic. The most infamous plantings in 1609 and 1619 occurred in Ulster, where Irish resistance to the English had been the strongest, where a rebellion was initiated in 1593, which spread to the whole of the island. Irish Gaelic lords were supplanted by mostly Scottish landlords and settlers whose loyalty to the English monarch was strong. While other plantings were attempted in 1556 and 1586, the Crown and private plantations in the north of Ireland left the largest legacy. Soon enough, we're going to put this map from 400 years ago next to the map of divided Ireland today, and wow, these plantations really set the stage. The Irish resisted England-backed settlements for centuries. An Irish Catholic rebellion in 1641 lasted a decade. Another rebellion in 1798, led by the Society of United Irishmen, sought to unite Catholics of Ireland to form an Irish republic. The British defeat of this short-lived rebellion had a major impact. The island had been called the Kingdom of Ireland, a subservient but separate colonial possession with its own parliament. But after suppression of the rebellion, the 1800 Act for the Union of Great Britain and Ireland merged the island of Ireland with Great Britain, beginning over a century of direct rule of a conquered Ireland from the Parliament at Westminster. Direct rule would keep Ireland at heel, so the theory went. But that theory was wrong, and we'll see why. After the British took direct control, what followed were more than 100 years of upheaval, guerrilla resistance, mass starvation, calls for rights, enfranchisement, the intervention of a world war, a rebellion near Easter, a series of firing squads, but above all, the voices of the Irish. For a better understanding of the Irish population, we need to leave our bird's eye view and zoom in on the next clue in our mystery of why the island was divided. That clue is the Irish experience before division. As seen with the plantings and the appropriation of Irish Catholic land to Protestants, the seeds of Irish division were planted long ago. But what else were the Irish people experiencing? Irish Catholics were limited by the English for centuries. Not only were there multiple efforts to remove Catholic landlords, but there was an explicit ban of Irish Catholics from voting or being elected members of parliament. A scattering of penal laws attempted to remove weapons from Irish Catholics, restrict Catholic education, ban Catholics from being army officers. There was even a dismounting provision disallowing ownership of horses over a certain size. My imaginary producer and I did indeed fact check the horse thing, and it's true. Though several of these anti-Catholic laws were repealed or replaced in the 1700s, they represent a real, effective, systematic effort to place Protestants loyal to the British Crown atop the political and cultural pyramid of Ireland. And it's important to note that by the 1800s, this wasn't as explicitly religious as it sounds. Catholic and Protestant became shorthand for fealty to Britain. Protestants were more likely to be Unionists. Catholics, the Celtic population, more likely to adhere to a brand of Irish republicanism or nationalism. Nonetheless, policies elevating Protestants over Catholics had consequences. For example, during one of the deadliest moments of Irish history, fewer Protestants died. Perhaps you've heard of the Great Irish Famine. Between 1845 and 1852, around 1 million Irish died from starvation due to potato crop failures and disease, all exacerbated by other food products being exported off the island. Another 1 or 2 million Irish immigrated to escape the blight. In all, about 25% of Ireland's population was dead or gone. Things were grim. On top of it all, the Irish couldn't control the efforts to combat starvation. The Act of Union meant they were directly ruled from London and thus had to send pleas for help to England. This led many to ask, what could solve this systemic problem? How could Irish people prevent such tragedy in the future? Some Irish people saw a solution in the Home Rule movement. Home Rule basically means Ireland governed from Ireland. These were not necessarily radical people, generally not separatists. They advocated a political path to Home Rule within the United Kingdom, desiring a devolution of powers from Westminster back to Ireland, a restoration of the Irish Parliament, a direct say in their governance. It's gonna be crazy to see how Home Rule was forever cursed. Right from the kickoff, 2 bills for Home Rule failed in London. One in 1886, another in 1893, and it ain't gonna get any better. But the idea of Home Rule did not die with these initial legislative setbacks. You'll notice momentarily this idea to empower Ireland through self-governance, ironically, would also play a major role in Ireland being cut in 2 different pieces. That's because first, the failure to achieve Home Rule fed into a new narrative of Irish nationalism in the early 1900s. Some nationalists actually opposed Home Rule granted by Britain because it was incremental. Home Rule was an attempt to compromise, to ask the British to pretty please pass a law to dole out some crumbs of self-government to Ireland. True power, thought emerging nationalists, could only come from fuller opposition to British rule, not asking politely, but rather throwing off the British monarch and becoming an independent republic. On the other side of the spectrum were those in Ireland that opposed any form of Home Rule. The population of the northern counties, particularly those furthest northeast, considered themselves British first and foremost. They saw Irish Home Rule as a weakening of the Union, a threat to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. 100 years of direct rule from London hadn't been a bad thing. The opposite was true. It had been a great thing to be part of the United Kingdom. Just like other British people in the UK, those in Ireland could send members of Parliament to Westminster to influence governance of the whole Union. Home Rule would threaten that arrangement. This unionist position was clear to see when a third Home Rule bill was proposed in 1912. To demonstrate their opposition, 471,414 unionist men and women signed versions of Ulster's Solemn League and Covenant. One version read in part, quote, "Being convinced in our consciences that Home Rule would be disastrous to the material well-being of Ulster, do hereby pledge to stand by one another in defending for ourselves and our children our cherished position of equal citizenship in the United Kingdom." If standing by one another in defending sounds metaphorical, it was not. It's explicit. At the first whiff of this new Home Rule bill, Unionists in Ulster began to raise a paramilitary force for active resistance of Home Rule. Things are coming into focus now. We've had big maps flashing bright light for future division, but to understand Ireland's geopolitical division, let's zoom in to our highest focus, to the stories of individual people. For example, why was a wounded man propped up and executed in a chair by a firing squad? The year 1912 does not only mark the proposal of the Third Irish Home Rule Bill, it also marks the beginning of the Irish revolutions. Let's kick off with some individuals. We need to know this individual. British Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith was a supporter of Irish Home Rule. His government successfully overcame decades of debate and resistance to pass the Third Irish Home Rule Bill in 1914. The law would create a, quote, Irish Senate and the Irish House of Lords to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Ireland. After 40 years of advocacy, finally, this law passed. It granted Ireland some self-governance. Again. But I said Home Rule was cursed. It wasn't to be. In 1914, the UK entered World War I. Because of the conflict, the Home Rule law was suspended. The Irish would have to keep waiting. It's kind of crazy. Home Rule is just doomed. It's like that episode of Star Trek when the Enterprise is stuck in a time loop and keeps blowing up over and over again. But one notable person, Patrick Pearse, an Irish nationalist, had a plan to overcome this Home Rule doom cycle. A plan to go around the British Parliament to force change. It's not going to be an effective or popular plan at the time, but it's a plan they're going to go with nonetheless. Starting in 1912, Pearse began to voice that an Irish uprising would be necessary if Home Rule failed again. Quote, "If we are cheated out of Home Rule again, this time there will be a Red War in Ireland." That by 1914, the UK was already at war, a world war, was no obstacle. In fact, British preoccupation with the European front could be used to Irish nationalists' advantage. And Patrick Pearse wasn't alone. He and 3 others of the military council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood planned what would be called the Easter Rising. In 1915, Pearse famously foreshadowed what was to come, quote, "Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." But at the time he said these words, this was probably not really yet the mood of most people in Ireland, even among nationalists. When Pearse and other nationalists launched the Easter Rising by taking buildings in Dublin in April 1916, they were, notably, not joined across the island of Ireland by other nationalists. The rising wasn't even particularly widespread at its center in Dublin, meaning the insurrectionists surrendered to the British by the 5th day. But here's the thing, the surrender on April 29, 1916 was not the end of Irish republicanism. On the first day of the Easter Rising, Padraig Pearse read aloud the proclamation of the Irish Republic. Alongside his name were 7 other leaders of the insurrection. Each of these men were executed by the British. The British didn't know they were creating martyrs. And that's because many saw the 7 conspirators as prisoners of war who had surrendered, and therefore rapid execution by firing squad was just a step too far. It was other perceived overcorrections alongside these firing squads that turned public opinion against the British and towards the nationalist cause. The most infamous execution was the last one, that of James Connolly. He had been injured during the Easter Rising and thus had to go before the firing squad propped up in a chair. The imagery of a perceived revolutionary, an injured man lined up and shot, catalyzed outcry. Now there's a lot of readings I cited below with different opinions, but here's mine. I think this is the moment we can say initiated Irish partition. The aftermath of the 1916 Easter Rising was a sea change. In the 1918 elections, 73 people from the nationalist Sinn Féin party were elected to Parliament out of a total of 105. And rather than take their seats in the British Parliament, many of the Sinn Féin representatives formed a separatist parliament in Dublin called the Dáil Éireann. The Dáil was to be part of a revolutionary provisional government to oversee Irish forces conducting a war of independence against the British. Therefore, the first sitting of the Dáil Éireann on January 21st, 1919 is considered the first day of the Irish War of Independence. The first real bullets of the war were fired that same day. The man with an oversized role in this provisional government and the Irish Republican Army is worth knowing. Michael Collins was an Irish revolutionary who came to great prominence during the War of Independence. Collins had also taken part in the Easter Rising but avoided execution. During the war, Collins became Minister of Home Affairs, Finance Minister, and notably Director of Intelligence in the Irish Republican Army, IRA. On the 21st of November 1920, he orchestrated Bloody Sunday, a counterintelligence operation in Dublin, during which 14 believed British intelligence officers were killed. The reason we need to know Collins is not only because of his role in the war, but because of his role in negotiations bringing the war to an end. His story will actually dovetail with the British Prime Ministers, because the same month as Michael Collins' Bloody Sunday, November 1920, the British government in London tried to salvage the Irish situation by making an old idea new. Irish independence forces had control of most of the south and west, and the British knew they needed a new tact. So a new British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, introduced the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. It was basically a 4th attempt at home rule. But wasn't it a bit late for home rule? Would home rule really placate an Irish rebellion? The Government of Ireland Act of 1920 sought to create 2 devolved Irish parliaments, one for the 6 counties of Northern Ireland and one for the rest of Ireland, what the law calls Southern Ireland. Though Ulster, the area of the northeast with the most unionist support, was 9 counties in total, the law excluded 3 of those 9 counties, ensuring the highest possible proportion of Protestant unionists in what remained, protecting those who wished to be cut away from the rest. The act passed and went into effect in Northern Ireland, resulting in a devolved Northern Irish Parliament. But the Government of Ireland Act was ignored on the rest of the island. Violence continued. The fight for independence was ongoing. In July 1921, a truce was called. Michael Collins, alongside Arthur Griffith and other Irish negotiators, went to London to meet with Prime Minister Lloyd George and British representatives. As promised, the storylines cross as both groups negotiate an end to the Irish War of Independence. During the negotiations, the Prime Minister threatened the Irish delegation, "Sign an agreement with us or we'll re-inflame the war with full force." As a result, the Irish delegation hastily signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty at 2 a.m. on December 6th, 1921. So what was this document? Well, it's just my opinion again, but I think the Anglo-Irish Treaty is super interesting. I wish I could do a whole video about it. And to top it off, it was pretty controversial. It wasn't just negotiated into the war, the treaty planned for Irish governance after the war. Now, the treaty provisioned that Ireland would not be fully independent. Instead, Ireland was to be the Irish Free State. It would have dominion status within the British Empire. Ireland's new status would be modeled on other former colonies like Australia, South Africa, and most similar, Canada. Ireland would govern itself, manage finances, public services, even create a recognized military. Now, at first that sounds pretty close to independence. Co-authors I read claimed in fact it was independence. Quote, "It was the document that granted Irish independence. The treaty was sovereignty in everything but name." Nonetheless, opinion of the treaty split Irish nationalists horribly. So what was so controversial about it? There are really two substantive things. First, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland would be able to opt out of this whole arrangement. Northern Ireland could choose to join the Free Irish State, or it could simply remain in the United Kingdom. If Northern Ireland opted to stay separate from the Irish Free State, that would obviously not be Irish unity. Oddly enough, in my reading, the Irish partition, the splitting of the island, was not what many Irish nationalists, most notably Eamon de Valera, found most objectionable about the Anglo-Irish Treaty. During debates in the Dáil, the second controversial fact about the treaty drew the most attention, and that fact is that the British monarch would still be the head of state, the figurehead for Ireland. Just like Canada and Australia still had the British king on currency, the Free Irish State would still recognize the crown. Most offensive to anti-treaty nationalists, Irish government officials would make pledges of loyalty to the King of England. When taking an oath of office, they would say in part, "I will be faithful to His Majesty King George V, his heirs and successors." For anti-treaty Republicans, this was a bridge way too far. British dominions like Canada, who pledged loyalty to George V, were subservient. I giggled at how authors of Birth of a State put it, quote, "The anti-treatyites did not wish to be Canadian." Despite heated and personal debate, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was narrowly approved by the Dáil in January 1922. Backing that up, the Catholic Church came out in approval of the treaty, as did most of the public who voted for pro-treaty parties in the 1922 election. It seemed that many were buying into Arthur Griffith's argument that the name Dominion was not as critical as the fact that this Dominion could self-govern. Or as Michael Collins put it, the treaty gave Ireland the freedom to achieve full freedom. The Free Irish State was coming into view. But the split among Irish Republicans over the treaty was a wound to last generations. The disagreements were so strong that anti-treaty and pro-treaty forces clashed for the following 10 months in the Irish Civil War. De Valera and Collins, once allies in the War of Independence, were now on opposite ends of a conflict between fellow nationalists. Pro-treaty forces prevailed in 1923. And for the moment, the arrangement of the Anglo-Irish Treaty was solidified. The northern 6 counties had opted out of the rest of Ireland, remaining inside the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. The rest of Ireland, the Irish Free State, was to make its way as a dominion of the British Empire. And if you do what we said and look back at the map of the major plantations from the 1600s, well, you'd be forgiven for thinking history was predetermined. And looking back now, the idea that this wasn't the end of the story, the end of the violence, that in the 20th century, Ireland would remain bitterly divided, that decades of troubles in one way or another were on the way, that the border would have intense complications, well, that all seems obvious in retrospect too. However, a lot of the actors at the time of partition were pretty casual about it all. The British cabinet settled on offering Unionists their 6 counties and calling it a day. To Irish nationalists, the British offered an abstract boundary commission to kick the can down the road and re-examine the Irish border at some point down the line. And despite their skepticism of all things British, Irish nationalists basically took this boundary commission at face value. They assumed one day the partitioned 6 counties would be untenable and just join the Irish Free State. Basically, from my reading, people at the time just put the blinders on to just see partition as a temporary fix to be remedied in due course. The constitution of the Irish Free State even alluded to reunification, quote, "Unity of Ireland shall thus be restored." Well, what do you mean, shall thus be restored? That there thus is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Perhaps we could describe these blinders not as blinders, but as optimism. After all, the birth of the Irish Free State was the first time Ireland could govern itself, truly, for 700 years, since the time of Gaelic kings. Because in reality, history is not predetermined. When the big picture, like geography and war, meets the smaller picture details like the experience and contributions of people or individuals, things change in unexpected ways. In Ireland, the big picture seemed to predestine partition, but it never actually did. The actions and distractions of people created the Irish border, and that means with effort and focus, people might get rid of it too.